All right, we are all ready to go.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us. We're excited to have, hopefully we get some more people that are able to join. I know sometimes after school schedules get turned on their heads at the last minute, but we're going to be talking today about effective school garden leadership. And a lot of you guys are, have worked with us in the past or are working with us now about, best practices for your garden. And that's really where we're going to kind of focus today, are what are the things that kind of get you the most bang for your buck when you focus on them. So, something that most people don't think about before starting a school garden is what it takes to keep it going. And I can think back to starting school gardens and being like, it's all about just the passion of it and what you think it's going to bring to education. Maybe you have a fantastic group that's sort of ready to go on it, but it takes time and money and people to keep a school garden going. So big surprise, it's just like keeping up a school, except that gardens are rarely included in a district budget. So we started the UT School Garden Support Team, back when we were doing Texas Sprouts. We were helping train the schools that we were, bringing school gardens to them. But the idea is that we want to, help train all of our school garden leaders who want to share great ideas. And we want to help you develop those best practices so that we don't have these school gardens that have to just like reinvent the wheel. You guys are sharing ideas with each other and making those gardens more likely to be sustainable. So I'm just going to start by introducing myself for those of you I haven't met. My name is Bonnie Martin, and I worked on Texas Sprouts prior to the Sprouting Teachers Program. So a lot of you all, if you're at a school that participated in Texas Sprouts, you might have seen me. I was sort of the advanced team that came out and helped with designing the garden and planning the build day. And I've since transitioned to the Sprouting Teachers Program, which is a one-on-one coaching program for teachers who are at schools with school gardens, helping them to really think about how to integrate the school garden into their curriculum. And I'm going to turn it over to Michelle.
Yeah, thanks, Bonnie. So my name is Michelle Hackett Cooper, and I also started working with this team as part of Texas Sprouts. So I was one of the educators with that project. So many of you may have seen me out in the gardens teaching kiddos in the last 4 years. Now that our Texas Sprouts project is over, I have transitioned to working on faculty at UT. So I'm a lecturer and I teach a couple courses in the nutrition department. And one of those courses has an associated internship program. So I'm the director of what we call the UT Outdoor Intern Program. And so that we'll tell you a little bit more about later, but it basically pairs UT students with various school gardens and teachers around the greater Austin area to incorporate more garden and nutrition lessons into their schools. Also on our school garden support team, we have a couple of other really important ladies. Valerie Cordes and Katie Nika are both team members of Bonnie's on the Sprouting Teachers team. And Valerie is a recent hire, so she's getting her feet wet, but I'm sure many of you have already worked with her. She's awesome. And Katie was actually going to be co-hosting this meeting with us today, but she just had a baby. So we're really excited for her and we miss her, but everything is going well with her and her new little one. And then Dr. Jamie Davis is kind of the instigator for all of these programs. So she is a professor in the Department of Nutritional Sciences at UT, and she was the primary investigator for the Texas Sprouts project. So she wrote the original grant. It was kind of her brainchild based off of a project that she ran in LA that had a similar goal. And her focus is really trying to study the impacts of gardens and healthy nutrition on childhood obesity and type 2 diabetes prevention. So she does really amazing work, and she's the one who brought all of us together to create this amazing team and support you guys. So just before we get started today, a few housekeeping notes. Most of you probably have done many Zoom calls by now, but just some reminders. If you're not speaking, make sure that you mute yourself just so we don't accidentally hear background noise or your dog barking or your baby crying. And if we do, it's okay, but just remember to try and mute. You can feel free to leave your cameras on because we love to see your faces when we're presenting. You guys know if you've taught online that it's really hard to teach to a bunch of black boxes. So feel free to leave your camera on. But that being said, just know that we are recording this webinar. So if you prefer not to be recorded, then obviously turn your camera off. As far as questions go, we will take some time to answer questions periodically throughout the webinar, and both Bonnie and I will be monitoring those. So feel free to use the chat box to ask questions, and then we'll take breaks sometimes just to refer back to those questions and make sure that you guys are getting all the answers you need. Sometimes throughout this webinar, we are going to have a break to check the Padlet. So you all got that link in the emails from me. And I also put the link in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and put that link in the chat one more time to everybody right now so that you have that. And you can go ahead and open that link right now just so it's ready to go. And we're going to be asking you guys throughout the webinar to add your ideas and concerns and questions within each category that we cover to that Padlet. And then periodically we will go over and share our screen and show that just to kind of see what you guys are saying. And if you have ideas about one key area that worked well for you, share that. If you have a really difficult problem or challenge, share that on the Padlet, and that'll be a way for us to connect with each other both during the webinar and then also afterwards. You'll have the link to keep using that as an idea sharing platform. And then during the times when we stop to check that Padlet, feel free to unmute yourself and we'll have a little more kind of off the cuff conversation during those Padlet checks. And then one last note, for those of you who are attending in person today, thank you so much for joining us. CPE credit will be given to people who are attending live. So you'll get 1.5 credits, and I'll be emailing fillable certificates to y'all. So it'll all be ready to go. You just need to fill in your name and print it, and that'll be your proof of attendance. But unfortunately, just due to the format of the webinar, we're only able to give credit to people who are attending live. So I'm going to take attendance in about 5 to 10 minutes. And if I catch you on that screenshot when you're here, then you will be getting credit. And if you happen to log in after I take that screenshot, unfortunately, we won't be able to give you credit. So that's kind of the distinction. It'll probably be right around 3:45 or 3:50 that I'll take the screenshot, and those folks will get credit. But if you have questions about the CPEs, just let me know, and we're happy to address that later.
All right, so let's get started. So our goal today is to give you actionable information. I'm sure a lot of you guys have sat in on trainings on school gardens, talked to others. And so what we want you to walk away with today are some things that you feel like you can go back to your leadership committee or hopefully like an idea for a leadership committee, even if you don't already have one, and really move the ball forward. So, how do you help your garden leadership committee move things that are going to be so your garden's thriving and sustainable? Just a reminder, we are all in different places on the path of development for our gardens. I've, gone to gardens and been like, that's exactly where I was like 7 years ago, right? And it feels like we all walk the same path and we have those same challenges. So our goal was really to just kind of like help you overcome those little speed bumps a little bit easier. I do want to mention that our talk is based around these factors that we're going to be talking about, and those are based on the Austin School Garden Survey research, which is we just completed the report on it. It was actually some research that was done where we had over 100 schools that replied to a survey, and then what we were able to do with some analysis was actually identify factors that multiply the likelihood of your garden enjoying success. So that's where we decided that those factors are so important. We really wanted to base our entire talk around that. If you want to know more about that report, there's going to be a November 18th webinar that Dr. Jamie Davis is going to be doing, where she's not only going to be talking about those results, but she's also going to be talking about the Texas Sprouts results, which for those of you who don't know, Texas Sprouts was a 5-year research study. And it was basically to try to understand how school gardens affect obesity measures in elementary age students and their families. So some really fascinating stuff. We're going to be sending you the link in our post-webinar email if you're interested. And you're welcome to, of course, always pass that on. Okay, so just to kind of like give you a sense of what we're going to be talking about today, I talked about those factors that we talked about, the predictors of a successful school garden. So these are the 7 highest predictors of a successful school garden: admin support, student usage, garden teacher training, available curriculum, having a garden committee, adequate funding, very, very big, and community partner usage. So those are the things that we're going to base our discussion around. So for each predictor, What we're going to do is we're going to talk about why is it important. And some of the things might be obvious, but we are going to hopefully have you think about them in a slightly different way. We're going to give you a couple of ideas to address the issue. And then at some point, and it may be after a couple of these topics come up, we will actually switch over to the Padlet. And that's where we want you to add things. And on the Padlet, you'll notice each column corresponds to one of these factors. So you can add questions you can add successes, best practices that you have for advancing that area. And so we'll just stop and briefly talk about those. So on the Padlet check, I think we've already put the link in there. We don't need to really stay here too long, but every time you see this symbol, we'll just stop and do a little check on the Padlet. Oops. And of course, that's what I just inadvertently did that. Let's go back. All right, there we go. So we're going to start out with admin support. So administrative support really should be the foundation of a strong school garden. It should be one of the first things that is gained, and that should be constantly developed. Now, I can name countless numbers of gardens where admin support, either you have an administrator who leaves and another one comes in, so maybe you don't enjoy the strong support you had with the previous one, or maybe it just wasn't as well developed as you wish it could have been later on. So, I think what I'd like to talk about today is the different levels, because I've had numerous conversations with people who are on this call where I've asked them, do you have admin support? Oh, yes, we have admin support. And then we really get into it and we understand the different levels of admin support. So if you look at the chart here, you understand low admin support. A lot of us will say, well, I have admin support because my admin approved the project. They say yes to things when I ask them. And that definitely is having administrative support. But what you might realize is that they're actually saying yes to things, but they might not be having active involvement. So one of the reasons why I say administrative support is so important is because in our research, what we're finding is that if you have high administrative support, it increases the likelihood of success and sustainability for your garden by 12 times, which is the highest factor that we found. So let me contrast having low admin support, where you have somebody who's saying yes to projects, but maybe no active involvement, with high administrative support, where they're actively promoting use of the garden to teachers, students, and parents. So they might be also helping, if there are challenges that the garden is having with things like funding or resources, they are using their knowledge of those possibilities and finding and encouraging you to go after and being able to reach those resources. So the power of admin support and why we believe it's, comes out on top when it has, 12 times factor for success is that when you look at some of the other factors that come up, and I've just outlined in yellow here, some of these other factors that admin support has an impact on. And so it really starts affecting everything around it. If you have the head of your school is supporting the garden, talking it up, talking about, yes, you should have a garden committee, and it can be an official committee, instead of just a couple of people, meeting in a room, but you also have to have time on other committees. Looking for funding, talking to the PTA, finding community partners, making time to have teacher training. These are all really important things to have. So let me give you just a couple of quick thoughts on how you can gain admin support. The first thing I call the 3 I's. So inquiring about your administrator's vision of the garden, involving them in planning, and then keeping them informed of your progress, your success, and your challenges. So I know some of you might say, well, is it too late to involve them? The garden's already started. Do I really need to still inquire about their vision? But my answer is yes, because you get them involved and it means that they have then a stake in the garden succeeding, and they're more likely to help you when you come up on challenges. So just remember those 3 I's. And even if you started without, a full kind of garden plan written down about it, a vision for the garden, things like that, it's really never too late to go ahead and write that. So if you are then incorporating your administrator's vision into the garden vision, then I think it's even more important because you're able to consider how your garden goals can reinforce your school and administrative goals and communicate with that in mind. That way, every time you're communicating about the garden, your administrator feels like you're supporting their goals as well. And that's critical. And then the third thing is it's really important to decide what success looks like. I sometimes feel like a lot of us are sort of chasing in a school garden, like what's the next what's the next thing I'm going to do? What's the next thing I'm going to do? But really try to identify a mission statement and goals for your garden so that then you understand when you've had success and what you're able to then do if you have what that vision of success, you're able to actually evaluate every year whether you're reaching success according to your vision, and you're able to report those results every year. There's nothing that's better for a garden than being able to report to an administrator, here was our vision and our goals for the year, and here are the ones we achieved, and here are what were the ones that we haven't achieved yet, but here's our plan to go after them. Okay, so, and again, we'll get to the Padlet. We're going to cover a couple of these and then we'll go to the Padlet. But if you guys have thoughts on them while we're going through, please feel free to just like switch over to the Padlet real quick and jot something down. So our second predictor that we're going to talk about is student and teacher use and engagement. So the level of student use of the garden is a huge indicator of how well integrated the garden is into the school as a whole. I think we can all think about gardens where maybe the garden exists for something after school, but it's not being used for curriculum. And so, you have a small group of students using it, or maybe one or two teachers. But if you end up having this integrated into the curriculum, your teacher and student usage is going to go a lot higher. So for teacher and student usage, what we find is that this is a factor that multiplies 11 times your likelihood that your garden will be successful. So again, right up there at the top. So I want to again just talk about the difference between high and low in this area. So we've got different, so think about a low level of student teacher engagement might be a single teacher driven garden where one teacher has maybe had the vision for it, built it, and they're the ones using it. A lot of times at these schools, people refer to it as that teacher's garden. Oh, that's Mrs. Smith's garden. I don't know whether it's available for us to use. And in fact, what often happens is that teacher spends an incredible amount of their spare time either finding funding and or maintaining or both. So at a high level of student teacher engagement, you're going to have teachers at every grade level using the school garden. They're going to be using it for not only to enhance their classroom curriculum, but they're going to be using it for maybe just getting out of the classroom, little break time. They might be using it for SEL lessons. Students are going to be involved in things like planting and harvesting and maintaining. And you're going to have a leadership team that shows representation from multiple grade levels. It would hopefully have an administrative representative and would also might have a parent representative, a PTA representative, something like that. At sort of the highest level, you might even have students on that garden leadership committee. So you guys can see the difference between those two is remarkable. And, although I think a lot of people will sort of tiptoe around a single teacher driven garden, the important thing is that when you look at that high level, that will actually make that single teacher driven garden or that single teacher have a lot easier time without having the burden all on their shoulders. So just a couple of questions here. For each of these levels, ask yourself, how easy is it to maintain the garden at this level of engagement? We talked about at that low level, it's all on the one teacher's shoulders. How critical would existing or new teachers feel it is to learn how to use the garden? If a new teacher comes into a school and Mrs. Smith has a garden, that teacher's not going to feel the need to really learn about using that garden. Whereas if they come in and they see 80% of the teachers are using the garden in some way, they're going to sure find out how they need to sign up for the garden and how they use it. And then finally, how important does it feel as part of the school? So are there traditions behind it? Again, would people describe it as our garden, or would it be that garden that's used by first grade or Mrs. Smith's garden? So a couple of thoughts on how to build garden use. So it is very important to establish some supported, and I say supported by, and I'm really referring to admin, supported by admin goals for usage for the garden. and then to go ahead and publicize them. There should be no secret about use of the garden. It shouldn't be like, oh, we're keeping it a secret, like the garden's there, but no one really uses it. What you want is you want to know that your goal is to have, let's say it's, 100% of your teachers using it. And then you want to actually evaluate how that's working. And those teachers who aren't using it, it's not a bad thing. You just want to find out what the barriers are and help pull those barriers down. So another way to build garden use is to offer teacher trainings, and we're going to talk about that next. So I'm not going to say much about that, but you can see how the more comfortable you feel using a garden, the more likely you are to use it. And then we encourage you guys to integrate the garden into every area of the school that you can. So there is no like one area where this is where the garden is pigeonholed. Just like I would say, I'm always saying to the teachers that we're coaching, like, it's not always about science. Even though science is the easy way to go, you can do every single subject that you're teaching in your school. You can find some way to integrate the garden. So think about beyond curriculum, special events that your community has could be held in the garden. Community relationships could be built by having things in the garden. Talking to your nutrition and food service people about having a partnership with the garden, and maybe having harvesting where you do food samples in the cafeteria. And then talking to your specials teachers, your art teacher, your music teacher, your PE. I've had some amazing ideas come from specials teachers about how to use the garden. Okay, so now we're just going to talk about garden teacher training. So teacher training, I want to make the point again that if teachers didn't receive training on how to use outdoor learning before they started teaching, and they didn't receive it at your school, then your garden is going to be limited to those who either are gardeners or feel really confident about going off plan for their lessons. And that tends to be a smaller group of teachers. So your goal is to have teachers feel confident using outdoor learning spaces. And that way your garden isn't constrained in how successful it can be. It will really open up the possibilities. So just some ideas about how to boost teacher training. And these are things that I've talked about with, numerous participants in this call in ways you could do teacher training. So just giving a tour of the garden, that in itself is training for teachers. Some of them may have never stepped foot in the garden. I know a lot of times when we do surveys at schools, we actually ask the question like, have you ever used the garden? And one of the options is usually what garden? Because there are some teachers who just don't even know that there's a garden there. Maybe it's on the other side of the school, maybe they park, and they never really go over there. So giving just a simple tour of the garden. In these times, a lot of the teachers that I work with are like, let's do a video tour. Let's just video something and send it out so they can at least just see it. It doesn't have to be within a big group. So doing a session with a instrument like Padlet, or even in like a Google folder or something, to share curriculum and share successes on how to integrate the garden into your curriculum. I had a great principal once that started faculty meetings in the garden once a season. So they would, maybe bring like some coffee out or something like that, or some soft drinks, and they would just start it out there, and just everyone would have some time, just like we often do with students when we bring them out, give them some time to kind of look around, and then they would go back inside and start their meeting. And it was a great way to showcase what was available in the garden. Labeling plants and adding fun details. We're not all gardeners. We don't all know every plant name. And so, I know there's nothing more frustrating to me than when I go to a botanical garden and I don't see labels on plants. So if you can just do that simple act of helping the teachers who don't know a lot about gardening to be able to just have a name associated with the plant. Establishing this new teacher garden orientation is just a great idea. If you get a teacher right when they join your school and you give them information about the garden, you give them some takeaways, you give them maybe a top 5 ways that they could first use the garden, it becomes something that they constantly associate with the school and they constantly see as a priority for the school. So just don't forget to get them right when they're coming into your school. I love the idea of a bulletin board. It doesn't seem like training, but it is information, and that's the value of it. So just having garden information, this is great for kids too. They love to know what's going on in the garden. So saying what's growing out there, what's going to be harvested soon, maybe have a garden joke or two, have some ideas for using the garden, and then just maybe some standard information about how they can sign up to use the garden. And then always, always look for these kind of more formal training programs. Sprouting Teachers is one of them. But there are a lot of organizations that do kind of like one-off webinars that you can do. And if you can do something like Sprouting Teachers, or Michelle's intern program, where you really have an organization that's working with your school one-on-one, then that's fantastic. All right, and the final one that I'll do before we go into the Padlet is just talking about available curriculum. So, you cannot throw a virtual stone on the internet without hitting some type of school garden curriculum out there. And it's important to have available curriculum. So this is a factor that increases, fivefold your odds of having a thriving, successful garden. But let me just point out immediately that I'm not talking about that it's absolutely necessary to introduce a gardening curriculum into your school. So you guys have a lot going on, and we recognize that. And the important thing is that you're just seeing the possibilities for integration into your curriculum, as well as if you look for other lessons, and that will get you a long way towards having something available. It is important for those who are not comfortable in the garden, for teachers who are not comfortable, to actually have some lessons that are easy to find. You guys don't want to spend a ton of time out there searching the internet for lessons. So here's just a couple of thoughts on it. Number one, most important, you have a curriculum. All you have to do is take your curriculum and connect it to the outdoors. And this is literally my job, that I have conversations every day with teachers about it. So it's not very tough. So that would be my number one recommendation, is don't worry about the curriculums you can buy and all that kind of stuff. Look at your existing curriculum and figure out how you can integrate that into the outdoors. Second, of course, use other existing curriculum. There are a ton of great ones. I'm going to show you a couple in just a second. But the third thing I would say is, work with your grade level or your instructional coach to identify places where you can take a lesson and modify it in some way to use. I mean, I know most districts, the curriculum department is not necessarily modifying for you and sending you something saying, if you have a school garden, here's another way you could approach this. It would be fantastic if they all were. But don't be shy about talking with your grade level about, hey, is there something coming up, so you can anticipate it, and it's something that becomes a standard for you to actually like integrate it at that point in your curriculum. So just talking about available curriculum, there are some things that come as like entire sort of sections. Like there's this packet, Do the Rot Thing, on composting. And so if you have an interest in that, you can get a whole bundle of lessons out of something like that. There's others that are just kind of like one-offs, where you can do like, here's how to do math in the garden. Here's how to do. So in my mind, these are great for you guys as more of a reference. It's more for inspiration, that you can look at this and say, oh, you know what? I see that this is how they're teaching perimeter in a garden. So I can take my existing perimeter lesson and I can incorporate some of that into it. So this is a great visual that I've used for years. I think I got it at one of the National Children and Youth Gardening Symposiums, where it just shows the number of ways that outdoors and school gardens can tie into the various subjects that you guys are teaching. And it's just so great, because it really does show, school gardens are just another location to teach. It doesn't mean that you have to go out and teach vegetable gardening. It could be that it's just going outdoors is actually the important integration that you're using. It could be it's just taking a brain break. And especially, this year in the times of COVID, getting outside is just so important for these kids. So don't feel like you have to have a very specific lesson. Oftentimes I'll tell teachers, to kind of dip their toes by just maybe taking like a 5-minute walk with their kids. And that's the first little foray out there. Take a 5-minute walk, have the kids do some observation, come back in and reflect on it. And then the next time, expand it to 10 minutes. And then at some point, you'll feel more comfortable with actually doing a lesson out there. All right, so we are going to do a Padlet check. Let's see. Sorry, things go backwards and forwards on here. All right. So just take a moment if you can, if you've got your Padlet open, think about something that you've been doing, either a question you have in one of these first couple of areas starting on the left, or best practices or a question you might have. And go ahead and put something in there that you want to share with others. And if anyone has a question, now's a great time. You can unmute and just ask a quick question. We can have some conversation. So I'm going to mention a couple of things here. So I noticed that I really like in the teacher student engagement, somebody posted about having ground rules. And it's something that I talk about a lot with teachers who are maybe a little bit nervous about taking their kids out for the first time. That a lot of you probably at the beginning of the year do these classroom contracts with the students or have them kind of come up with rules on behavior for the classroom. The garden doesn't have to be any different. You could have them come up with a very short list of expectations for the garden. And I don't think our list would change that much from each other. So it might be things like, walk on the pathways, or, leave the flowers and vegetables for everyone to enjoy rather than picking them for yourself. I always try to think of those rules in more of a yes fashion than a no fashion. And obviously sometimes you have to be pretty straightforward with it. But have your class come up with that and then have it like on, something that's kind of on a bulletin board or laminated that you can pull out anytime you're about to go to the garden and just have a quick review of that.
Bonnie, I'll share something else on behalf of Janie Lake, who was one of our early members of the call. She mentioned that, or no, it was on behalf of Nicole Jones at Mitchell, who was saying that the Girl Scouts are working in their garden at Mitchell. So that's a great example of community integration, which we're going to talk about in a little while. But she said that the Girl Scouts are using QR codes as a way to label the plants. And so when we start thinking about student engagement and teacher engagement, that's a wonderful way to link really quick and easy information to plants in the garden. So Nicole, if you haven't already, you could definitely add that to this column on the Padlet of just, what a great idea. It doesn't take much work to make a QR code to generate that. And you could link to a botanical website with all kinds of information about that plant. And as long as that label is durable, I mean, that can last for quite some time out in the gardens. So definitely a really nice idea that you could, just an example of something you could share using this Padlet resource.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. And I would also suggest that, your signs for plants don't have to be real complicated. I've made signs for plants that are just like, I think Cliff and I were talking about this the other day, maybe that, I just bought those little Avery business card things. And then I put the plant name, and then I might choose a little icon, either a butterfly, a bee, or a hummingbird based on what that plant might attract. And then I would laminate them and duct tape them to landscape staples that I would put in the ground. So, they'd last for maybe a year and then I'd have to replace them. But that's, a year of teachers and students knowing exactly what that plant did for the garden. Any other questions? I think I think some of the ideas here are fantastic about, making sure that you are spreading out the responsibilities for things here. And it's not all sitting on one person's shoulders. We're going to talk a lot about that in the Garden Leadership Committee section about making sure that this doesn't all fall on one person, because then your likelihood of your garden failing really, really skyrockets. Okay.
All right, so great segue, Bonnie, thank you. The next predictor that we want to talk about, when we're looking at these predictors for a successful school garden, it was reported that the presence of a garden committee at a school really increases the likelihood of a garden succeeding. Now, I know when you think of committees, this meme sometimes represents how you feel. about joining a committee. And it might represent like your ideas of about, no, I don't want to do one more group or one more committee or one more commitment. But we're going to just talk about the ways that we can spread that committee responsibility among multiple members and even outside of the committee so that it doesn't feel like a burden. So just before we start talking about some tips for how to have a strong and robust garden committee, I do want to just launch a quick poll just to gauge the temperature and see how many of y'all are aware of a garden committee at your school. So just a yes, no, or I don't know question, and it's all anonymous, so there's no shame if you don't know. And I'm going to wait till most people have voted, and then we'll go ahead and share the polling so you can see with everybody what the responses were. I also want to point out that if you are a committee of one, let's have you say no to this question. If you're the only person on the committee, and I'm thinking of a couple of examples in my mind, you know who you are. All right, looks like we have 25 of 33 people, so you can, perfect. And I see your comment here. As district staff, I said no, that's just fine. If you're not a member of an individual school, then you can say no. Okay, we have 25 people who've shared. I'll wait and see if we get another one or two chiming in on this poll. Okay, I'll go ahead and share these results with y'all so you can see them. So most of you guys, more than half, said yes, there is some type of garden committee present at your school. A few of you all said no, and a couple of you said, I don't know, and that's okay. What we're going to talk about will help you to, if you have an existing committee, it'll help you to make sure that your committee is robust and can help spread those roles around within the committee and also outside of the committee. If you don't have a committee, this section will hopefully give you some ideas of how to start one up so that you're not just doing the tasks of managing the garden by yourself. So as we jump in, we start thinking about the importance of a garden committee really with three main topics in mind. We think, okay, committee members have to do all the maintenance. They have to go out and do the weeding, and they have to do the watering themselves. And committee members are the only ones who can actually use the garden. So they can go out and use it with their classes. And sometimes teachers who are not on the committee think the same thing. Oh, well, I'm not on the garden committee, so I don't know what's going on, so I can't use the garden. And then the third piece is that we usually think of the garden committee as being the sole responsible parties for finding funding, either in monetary or in-kind donations for the garden. So the committee roles can be very kind of wide. And when we think about it this way, it sounds like, oh my goodness, this is so much work. I don't want to be a part of this group. But now we're going to look at the depth and the way that we can spread these roles across multiple people to make it not a burden to be a part of a committee. Because remember, this is a huge predictor of garden success. So we want to spend some time figuring out how we can make this an enjoyable task and not a burden. So we first dive into maintenance. We do know that the committee should not be the only responsible parties for weeding and watering. That's really not a sustainable way to run a garden committee because people are going to get burned out and the garden will end up being neglected. So instead, committee members should think about their role not as being the actual maintenance team. They don't have to go out and weed and water in person, but they can make a plan for maintenance that then can be populated by other people in the community and in the school. So for example, they can help to make a plan about who's going to come up into the schools during breaks and who's going to be watering over the week of Thanksgiving when no one's there, or the 2 to 3 weeks of winter break when no one's there, or the 3 months of summer when the garden needs tons of water, really productive, but no one is there. So the garden committee shouldn't be doing those jobs themselves. They can make a plan for the breaks. They can also make a plan for how to make sure that maintenance is spread across the whole school during the school year by programs like class adoption. And so this is a really simple model where every single class in the school, or even on a smaller scale, every class in a grade level is responsible for adopting the garden for a week at a time. That's the class that goes out and waters, makes sure the garden is relatively free of weeds, uses it as a brain break for the week, and just kind of oversees that maintenance. And there's lots of representative ways to share who is adopting the garden, from hanging a golden painted plastic trowel on the door of the responsible classroom, to putting up a poster, to posting pictures on social media. So there's lots of ways for classes to feel proud of that job. And then also this maintenance piece can go to work days. So often, Bonnie and I have hosted work days at gardens or attended work days at gardens, and the only people who show up are the committee members themselves. That's not ideal. Ideally, committee members would help spread the word among the school and the greater community and get other volunteers to the garden to help with those big tasks that need doing. So it should be a whole group project rather than just the few members of the garden committee. So now if we look at usage and the depth of usage, the committee is not the only people who can go out and use the garden with their classes, right? They should be spreading the word that the garden has an open gate per se. So people from the community might be able to come and use garden beds. And that could be during the year if you have extra beds, or it could be during school breaks. After school clubs, like one of the schools that I've worked at had Boys and Girls Club. They had a portable right next to the garden. Perfect integration there. So the Boys and Girls Club was able to come and use that garden in the after school hours, and they helped with maintenance. So that ties into both of these areas. The committee can also help to make sure that the garden can be a site for school events. So working with organizations like the PTA or Catch Night to host different activities in the garden space and use that as just one more venue at the school where things can be held to bring the community together around that space. And then lastly, it's the job of the committee to make sure that all of the classes in the school know that they can use that garden space. And finally, when we look at the fundraising branch, yes, sometimes the committee, they're in the know about the garden, so they feel like they have the burden of fundraising, but there are so many resources within the school that can help with this. So maybe someone who's not on the committee has experience with writing grants, and so you could tap into that person even though they're not on the committee. That might be a skill that you can borrow from to help support the garden. Maybe someone on the committee has a connection to free resources. So they're not going out and buying plants themselves, but they know of a way to get free resources, right? Or perhaps someone knows someone else who has the ability to elicit in-kind donations for the garden. So there's lots of different ways that we can have not just breadth that's spread across a few committee members, but also depth of the garden committee to really support the garden without overtaxing people who are a part of this group. So what are our three main tips for making sure that you have a robust garden committee? Firstly, it's to either form or maintain, whichever place you're at your school, an active garden committee. And by active, I don't just mean that people's names are listed on a piece of paper as being members. I mean that people are engaged in the well-being of the garden and in integrating the garden into the school, and also are regularly showing up for meetings, no matter how often they occur. That's what I mean by active. So how do you start this process? Well, first, make sure you cast a wide net. Teachers, y'all know that you are overtaxed and underbenefited, right? And so don't just recruit teachers for this committee. It's a great idea to have at least one admin, even if they just show up to the meetings as kind of an authoritarian figure of approval. See if they can come to a couple of meetings. It will really lend some gravitas to your committee. And also start to elicit community members. A lot of times retirees who've lived next to a school for years are so happy to be part of a group like this. Or if there's a church that's nearby, maybe someone from the congregation wants to come and be a supporter and a stakeholder in the garden. So make sure you have a wide net for recruiting people and asking them to join the committee. Once you have members identified, give people small but meaningful roles or responsibilities. These could come with titles if people want them or not, but maybe one person is responsible for posting something to social media once a month about the garden. Super small, manageable role, but it would give them a stake, and so they would feel like they need to stay a part of this committee and give of themselves to help support it. So really small but meaningful roles can help to enhance the committee. Identify the most effective communication strategies. So this is both for communicating together as a committee, but also for spreading information outside to the rest of the school community. So maybe as a committee, email doesn't work because everyone's emails these days are flooded. So instead, maybe you want to have a group meet or a WhatsApp group, or even just a text message chain, good old fashioned text message chain. And that could be a great way to communicate information among committee members. When you're looking at sending information outside to the rest of the school and the greater community, Tap into all the available resources. So in non-COVID times, or if you have a really active school right now, a bulletin board or the school marquee, these are great ways to send out short, meaningful announcements about the garden. Use people's classroom web pages or the school's website. See if they can add a tab about the garden, or something across the running banner at the top of the school website or the school social media platform. Lots of ways to spread communication about the garden and about the committee itself, kind of outside of just that small group of people. And then lastly, as with any group, it's really important to establish regular meeting times. So maybe you want to meet once a month. You pick the third Wednesday of every month. That's when you're going to have your garden committee meetings. Maybe you only want to meet every 6 weeks. So every sixth Tuesday, before school starts. Pick a time that works for your members and set a regular meeting date. This often works much better than setting the next meeting date at the end of the previous meeting, because then people get left out if they weren't at that meeting. So it's better just to have a regularly recurring meeting time and have an agenda for your meetings with broad topics like class use update, maintenance update, and then just fill in the blanks under those topics and stick to that agenda. That will really help your meetings to run smoothly and efficiently. So this is just basic organizational tips, but for these committees, it's really important, if you want to have a robust one that's long lasting, that you follow some of those basic organizational strategies. The next tip for having a robust committee is to actively pursue training opportunities for members. So that could be things like coming to this webinar. That could be things like if you see a grant writing workshop hosted by someone, send one of your committee members to that grant writing workshop, because those are transferable skills. It could be something like a horticulture or a native plants class if you want to increase your gardening. We've talked about some of these optional teacher trainings. Something about curriculum integration, like with nutrition or outdoor curriculum. Or something that's probably overlooked, if you're not super comfortable using social media or using online platforms to spread information, go to a brief training or a short webinar about how to maximize social media to its fullest potential to spread information about something like a garden. And that, one person going to that can bring back a lot of really refreshing new ideas to support the garden and the committee. So think outside the box when you're thinking about how to pursue trainings. And then the last tip for having a robust committee is just to really take a good inventory of the available resources within your committee members that can help to manage the garden. So what resources exist inside the school? Maybe someone in the school has supplies that they can donate. I worked at one school where someone's mother-in-law passed away and she was an avid gardener. And so this teacher came to me and said, can I donate all of my mother-in-law's gardening tools to the school garden? And I said, yes, that would be wonderful. And some of it we couldn't use and some of it we could, but that was perfect. So maybe there's some relationship like that, or maybe someone at the school has a skill. Maybe they're a carpenter, or maybe they took the Master Gardener program. So try to tap into committee members' individual resources like skills and knowledge, and physical resources, or even if they know of someone who knows of someone who knows of someone who has a skill. Try to tap into all of those networks. Next, within the committee, try to figure out if you guys have shared knowledge of outside programs. So maybe if one of y'all has worked with the UT Outdoor Intern program that I manage, and the other people in the committee haven't heard of it, or you have new teachers who don't know about it, share that information about those outside programs. If one of y'all worked with Bonnie in the Sprouting Teachers program, or with Tatiana in the first year of the Sprouting Teachers program a couple of years ago, but no one at your school has worked with them since, bring that back up and start using the grapevine to spread knowledge about these outside programs. And then lastly, tap your resources within the committee to know what local resources exist in the community. So is there a corporation or a scouts group or a church group who could volunteer? Is there a small business who'd be willing to donate something in kind, or who'd be willing to, give a little bit of money in exchange for popping up a sign at the garden? So what connections do you have within the committee that also reach more broadly? So these are kind of 3 tips for helping to build up a robust garden committee that can then support the success of your garden overall. So this was a long section, so we're going to go ahead and go to the Padlet now, just to see if you guys had any things that work well or challenges with the garden committee section. And Bonnie, because you're running this on your computer, I'm going to have you facilitate the Padlet conversation, if that's all right. I
Yeah,
think you can
that's
just
fine.
see it more easily.
Yeah. So yeah, so if you guys have suggestions or questions about effective ways to have a garden leadership committee or run that, I see Cliff has already put a suggestion in about spreading the wealth, providing for future care if someone is not available to continue. That's exactly the main thing we talked about, is don't put it all on one person's shoulders. If somebody has started the garden, I will repeat this, if they've started the garden and you're afraid of stepping on their toes, I really think that you will find that person is so pleased to have a committee of people to support them that they will not mind at all. Someone suggested about our committee is blended into our science committee. So I like that idea. I think that's great as long as it doesn't get sort of deprioritized because of that. Yeah, and I would just say also, like, somebody commented that they don't have a garden committee yet. I would say, first step is just, taking that step that Michelle said about casting that net and then letting your principal know or your AP know so that you can make that like an official committee. Because I realize that having it as an official committee oftentimes means that it satisfied some committee requirements that teachers have. Any questions about committees?
Yes. How do you, hi, this is Uriel Velasquez. How do you get more more? I currently have a committee in my school, but some of my committee members are not gardeners and they want to participate, but they don't participate.
Yeah, so I would say, Yadiel, this is a great question. Just because you're on the garden committee does not mean you have to go, as Janie Blake put it, get dirt under your fingernails, right? If that's not your wheelhouse, you don't have to go outside and pull weeds. And in fact, the committee shouldn't be the people who are doing the majority of that work. But maybe I think the biggest thing is, like I was saying, to tap into their other skills and assets that can then be transferred to the garden. So if they're really tech savvy, or if they're always on Twitter or Instagram, ask them to use those skills to put out posts about the garden once a month or every other week or once a week if they want to. Or if they are really finance savvy, ask them to put together a draft budget that could then be presented to the administration or the PTA and say, if we had, start small, $200 in a year to manage the garden, this is what we could do. These are all of the amazing changes we could make. Or let's say that someone is really handy with, woodworking. See if they could make a couple of benches to bolster the outdoor classroom area of the garden. So it doesn't have to be that they want to get outside and do things in the garden. There's a lot of other skills that can be used to transfer onto the garden. Bunny, do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I go back to your slide of, all the different things that are useful to have on a committee. And sometimes it's just the person who's just like really good at recruiting people, or is like the marketing. I was talking to Cliff and his team at Brook Hall the other day about like marketing and how important just marketing the garden is. So if you are really just good at that, then that's a skill that the committee needs.
Or if you have someone, oh, go ahead.
So in the previous, so in the previous semesters, what I have done is I tend to divide my committee members, assign them roles, like a secretary to take notes and stuff. And this last semester, I had assigned like one of the committee members that was interested in participating, choosing not decorations, but like more like decorative stuff to get the students to participate more and finding designs. Also like having them write like information for grants so we can get them. However, they were like they did not know how to do that. Like, is there a way or resources for us to access it so that they can do it like better this year or better this semester?
Yeah, that's a great question. So firstly, I would start off, rather than by assigning people specific tasks or roles, take an inventory and ask like, what are some skills that you have or some interests that you have? And then from the outset, they might do a better job, a better job of actually fulfilling the roles that they've been given. But if, if someone just says, oh, I'll try to write a grant. I've never done it before, but I'll try. There are training resources available online. We run webinars from time to time about various things like that. And we've actually talked about grant writing as one of the webinars that we might possibly run in the future. And then, you can always tap into outside organizations and ask for help or for trainings on those things. So, start by assigning a role. Well, start by inventorying people's interests and assets, and then you can assign roles. And then from there, it might just be that people need a little bit of help on where to get started. So share with them, if you even do a simple Google search of tips for writing a grant, you can find those things. And as a leader on the committee, if you share that with the grant writer, then it won't feel like they're just groping in the dark, right? It might feel like, oh, I have a place to start. And my starting point is to look at what's in the garden and figure out what we need first, do a simple needs assessment. So if you give them some of those step-by-step kind of ways to start out, it might feel less daunting.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, great question.
I would
Leslie, I see
also
that you have
add-
your hand raised.
Oh.
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to add really quick. I think it's important when you do amass this kind of like knowledge for something, it's a great thing to keep a binder for the garden committee or even for maybe a specific position. So for example, if someone's writing grants and they've checked out and looked at, like 15 different grants and they've decided to apply for like maybe, 3 of them, it's a great idea to have that person keep a binder that's then passed on to the next person that writes grants so that they can see, there should be copies of the submitted grants. There should be something that shows where we were notified, whether you got it or not. All those things are so critical, again, to not reinvent the wheel every year, but to actually, even the person who's responsible for maintenance in the garden, they should keep some type of a sketch in that binder that shows the rotation of the crops, like where tomatoes were planted one year so that the next year they can be put in a different location. That's important from a maintenance standpoint. It doesn't seem like important from a committee standpoint, but that kind of knowledge of the people that are running, running the garden is critical for future years and makes the committee's job become easier and easier.
Yep, absolutely.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Leslie, I saw that you had your hand raised as well.
I did. I'm at Pillow Elementary. This is our second year working on the gardens, and we actually have a retired couple who live close by, and they do so much. But I'm the only teacher who does lessons in the past 2 years outside or with the garden and journals. We did have a garden committee that started, and I so like the idea, and it just kind of fell apart. So I think we'll get together and like make a garden inventory and then put that out to the faculty and say, okay, this is what we need. Because you're right, if there's somebody who's posting on Twitter, we could get that person, if they're a tech savvy, they could do that part. And maybe that's a way, because the garden committee just kind of went, oh, well, and then you're right, it's the couple and me and another teacher, and we do it all. As much as I've tried to get it going, we really need other people to support what we're doing.
Yeah, Leslie, and that actually just gave me a great idea. Just as a side note, I live like 4 blocks from Pillow. I walk by there every day with my family.
Oh, okay.
It's nice to know a teacher who's in the neighborhood. We'll have to connect.
I'll contact you.
So, a really kind of a sneaky or backdoor way to get about this might be to send out an asset inventory to the faculty. See if you can get your admin to kind of promote that, and just say like, really simple, like 2 questions. What's your name? And then give them a range of like, what skills do you have? And give them some options like social media, budgeting, gardening, art and design, like all of these kind of random skills, so they don't quite know what they're signing up for or what they're giving you. And then when they fill that out, you can then look at that list and say, what do we really need? Do we want someone who has social media skills? And then you can contact that person and be like, hey, you filled out this form for us and it says that you're really good at Twitter. Would you be interested in helping once a month make a small ask, to support the garden? And if so, then you can write on your resume or on your CV, like I was the social media correspondent for the Pillow Elementary School garden, right? So you can kind of be sneaky about that and find what people are interested in doing and what their skills are, and then approach them individually. Typically, when you're looking for committee members, if you individually reach out and make an ask, a one-on-one ask to someone, they are much more likely to say yes than if you send out a blanket request that people can just ignore. So for recruitment, that's a really great, put on your used car salesman hat, and that's a really great way to get people involved. Is especially, I mean, it's hard during COVID, but especially a personal ask, like a phone call is better than an email, right? A face-to-face is better than a phone call. So if you can tap into someone, you already know they have that skill, you can make that individual ask. That might be a great way to start building up your committee, even just a couple people at a time.
So I want to just mention that one of our friends from Whole Kids Foundation just put in the chat that they also have a little grant writing tips document. So, take it from them. Those tips are going to be valuable. So I'll add that into the Padlet as well as a resource for you guys.
Perfect. Thanks, Bonnie. And thank you. I'm guessing that was Tristana from Whole Kids. So thank you very much. Janie, go ahead and share. I saw your hand was raised as well. Oh, let me unmute you here. Let me see. Can you unmute yourself? For some reason, I can't.
Did my computer skills are slim and none.
No, you got it. You got it.
One of the things that I wanted to add that has worked real well for me is that recently the kids and I started a seed bank, and we wanted to communicate about this. And I knew that if I put it in the email, that it was just gonna, and I did door hangers. Don't forget door hangers on all the classroom doors. And the other thing that worked really well for me for going out is the kids' lunch boxes. Don't forget those for communicating.
Yes, great ideas. So when you're trying to send information out to the school, yeah, door hangers are great. Teachers' mailboxes, we used to use mailboxes all the time in Sprouts, just put, especially if it's brightly colored, so it doesn't just mix in with all the other white paper. That's a great way to spread information if you're in person. And if you have physical kids, yes, a flyer to take home in the lunchbox is a great idea for spreading information out to the broader community. If you're virtual, that could be something that you post on the classroom website. If you send out a weekly newsletter to families virtually, have a big prominent section where you can feature something about the garden. Those are great ideas. All right, so really awesome conversation around garden committee, you guys. Thank you for sharing that. So for the sake of time, we're just going to move on to our last two predictors, and then we'll go back into the Padlet once more before we end. So when we think about the kind of sixth predictor of a successful school garden, this comes down to adequate funding. So when we mean funding, just to kind of talk about the importance of this briefly, funding was identified by teachers as the #1 barrier that they feel like they face to having a successful garden, is not having the physical, monetary resources to support the work they want to do in the garden. And teachers should not be paying for things for the garden out of pocket. That's just, there are ways around that, right? So really important as far as teacher perspective. And also funding was identified. If a garden has adequate funding, the report found that that would lead to a 3-fold increase in your garden being thriving or successful. So we know that according to you all, funding is important. And now we're going to look at why and how you can bolster your garden's funding. So when we think about funding, there's a couple of ways that funding can be allocated, right? So the first way is if funding is allocated to resources. So these are physical things that can support the garden. And that could be small recurring purchases, like every year or every season, you're going to need to purchase plants, maybe compost, seeds, maybe you need to replace tools that get broken or lost, seedlings, and then every probably couple of years, you'll need to refill the soil in your garden beds as it gets compacted and removed when you harvest plants. The other way that we can allocate funding is to personnel. And so this could be either to pay for someone who is a garden coordinator who is leading the charge in the garden. This could be an outside organization like, Texas Sprouts was a free resource for schools, but we were paid by UT. So, that was a way that kind of outside funding was allocated through a different different channel. Or a school could pay for personnel. So a school could pay for an organization like Peas to come in with an educator who helps to get classes out into the garden and helps to try to integrate the garden into that school community. Or the other option that many schools do, if they have a little bit of extra money, is that they could pay a staff person who's already on staff at the school, perhaps as a teacher or in another support staff role, to then also take on garden leadership or garden management as one of their job duties, basically. So getting a little bit of payment for that role. The other way that money can be allocated to personnel is to pay for a maintenance crew to help with basic things like making sure the garden is weeded and making sure that the edges are always trimmed so weed seeds don't fly in, making sure that there's adequate water levels, maybe even doing some minor soil testing. It depends on who you hire. But a good example of this is that our friends at Whole Kids Foundation just recently gave us some money that we allocated to some of your schools for a landscape crew to come out and clean up the school garden if it had been neglected since we went virtual in the spring, which some of y'all had some pretty intense gardens. So personnel can be a couple of different things, but this is why funding is important. It can be used to support a lot of different areas of the garden. So how do you increase your revenue streams or your donation streams within the garden? So 3 main tips: grants, donations, and fundraising. Starting off with grants, usually what you'll find is that there are a ton of grants available to initially build a school garden. However, it's more difficult to find grants to sustain existing school gardens. So just know that when you look for grants, it can feel like an uphill battle, but some of them do exist. The other kind of issue that people run into with grants is that writing a grant, especially for the first time, can be time intensive and can take a lot of work. Grants are, difficult to get. And so the first time you're writing one, it can be a lot of work because you really want to make sure you have a robust grant application or application essay. So the best way to do this is to really have a strong initial application, a strong ask, a strong proven need, and then identify a couple of grants that you can kind of reuse that same application for every year. And maybe you tweak it, maybe you strengthen it as you go on, but you shouldn't have to rewrite a new grant application every time you apply for something. You should be able to use the same information, the same basic kind of need that you've identified to apply for a grant year after year and multiple grants if you find some that are relevant to your school situation. When we look at donations, look for a couple of different types of in-kind donations. So these could be supplies like tools or even things like buckets, or they could be pass-along donations. So some farms or even plant nurseries will have plants that have been seeded and they are seedlings, but maybe they're like a little sickly looking. Maybe they're just excess and they don't need all of the extras. Maybe they've gotten too big so that they don't want to put them into the farming system because they're going to be out of sync with the other plants that are already in the rows. Whatever it might be, sometimes these different small farms or nurseries will donate pass along plants or transplants to a school garden just because they have excess. There's also some donations like SFC has a resource called Spread the Harvest that many of you all are already tapped into. This is a free community resource where you can pick up seedlings, compost, and transplants, and they have this donation giveaway day twice a year. Information about that is posted at the end of the webinar, so you'll have that resource. And then you can also do things like set up a Donors Choose website, which many of you have done for your classrooms. Do that for the school garden, right? And identify some areas where donations could be allocated and give people some options. Or even make a physical ask to home improvement stores. We've had a great relationship with Texas Sprouts with Home Depot in the past. So if you go to your local Home Depot and ask for the manager or the assistant manager, tell them what you're doing, wear your school t-shirt, and they will likely be able to help you out with something, even if it's small, and just build that relationship with them. Because then when you have another ask down the road, you can show them pictures of, we use the buckets you donated for seeding, and now we're back to ask for a couple of trowels. Like, the kids are out there, can you help them get in the soil, right? So kind of build that relationship and develop some rapport, and that can be a great way to ask for in-kind donations. And then lastly, good old-fashioned fundraising. This can be something that is done specifically for the garden, so a garden-specific fundraising event, or you could ask for an allocation of fundraising that's done through an organization like the PTA to see if you can get money donated and set aside. And going back into the garden committee and kind of roles that people can have, this is a really great way to tap into someone who has budgeting skills, because if you're going to be asking for money, people are going to want to see where you're going to spend that money. So as a fundraiser, or if you're going to be going to the PTA or the administration, you can say, this is exactly how we are going to allocate any money that's given to us for the garden. And that'll be a really, really great way to help people kind of help you meet a fundraising goal, like those thermometers that you sometimes see, and you put up the colored paper to see how much you have left to do. That's a great thing that you can do either at your school physically or in person, and help people kind of feel like they're invested in fundraising for the garden. And then the last predictor that we'll talk about briefly is establishing some community partners and getting those partners into the garden to help use it. This is another one that was one of the predictors of having a threefold increase in having a thriving garden, is if you have some community partnerships. So why is this so important? Why does community involvement influence the likelihood of having a thriving garden? Well, a couple of different things. So communities or nonprofits can really play a key role in helping with both physical maintenance. So community members or nonprofit members can come and help with work days, or they can help oversee physical maintenance of the garden, or things like, for those of your schools that were involved with us, we're a higher ed institution, but we're not a nonprofit. But when we had extra money for maintenance, we were able to give that to you, right? So that ties into funding, but also into community partnerships. And also some community partners can even help with facilitating programming. So one of the examples we'll talk about is Master Gardener organizations. So these are typically groups of retired people, but not always retirees, but they have taken classes and are in training programs through an agricultural extension office in whatever county that they live in, and they are looking for volunteer hours. So that's a great way to ask them to help you lead a class in the garden, so they can get hours that way, or to help you with a work day. So they can community members and nonprofits can help to facilitate a lot of different work as well as programs. And then obviously, the more connections you have with people in a community, the more people and expertise and overall resources you can tap into. So when you get that donation for a shade structure and you have all the materials and you look at this pile and you say, well, now I have no idea how to build this. Then you can tap into your community partners and say, does anyone have carpentry skills? And your community partners can come out and help you put that together, okay? And I see a great comment. Master Gardeners have to continue to volunteer yearly to keep their Master Gardener certification active. Yes. So when we look at these partnerships, that's something else to keep in mind, is once you establish relationships, it's easy to keep those going. So 3 tips, or really 3 places to look for community partners. The first is paid partners. So a lot of nonprofits, for example, Peas, which I've mentioned before, they are for fees. So you pay them to help you, but in a way, it's almost like outsourcing some of that work of the garden. But you are getting teachers trained, you are getting help with making a maintenance plan, you're getting kids out to the garden at the same time. So there's benefits there, right, of having a paid partnership if your school has that funding or that resource. There's free partners. So they can be the Master Gardeners that I've mentioned, UT programs like what Bonnie and I are associated with, or even corporate partners that can be free. So lots of times corporations are looking for good deeds to do. So allocating volunteers to certain volunteer activities, they can come out and help with a work day or setting up some kind of infrastructure for the garden, or they can provide donations so that you can get something for the garden that you really need. But you have to have that relationship with the corporation first for them to be able to tap into the garden and know that that's where they can allocate some of their resources. And then lastly, we've already mentioned this in other capacities, but look at the community around the school. Is there a group of community gardeners that wants to come in and help support the garden, or even a garden club? Maybe they don't have a community garden, but maybe it's a group of people who are avid supporters of gardening and they want to help tie into the school. Are parents, existing parents at the school, are they interested in helping to support the school garden? Look at the HOA or neighborhood associations around the school. Just thinking about Pillow Elementary, where I live and where Leslie teaches, we have a really active neighborhood association. So how could that help to support a garden? And what could they do to even just get the word out about a need for the garden? Look at Scouts organizations, or the last one is blocked on my screen for some reason, Bonnie.
Feeder schools.
Oh, feeder schools, thank you.
Mhm.
So feeder schools would be like the middle school or the high school that comes next. So are there older kids who want volunteer hours or who want to use that space and that can help kind of join in? So I know like Mitchell is located right next to their brand new feeder school. great way to establish a relationship. One of our former Texas Sprout schools, Pickett, was right across the street from Tippett, which was their feeder elementary school. Pickett is now, I believe, closing soon or already has closed, but that was a great way to establish relationship. They were literally right next to each other. So there's a lot of different partnerships that can be established, paid, free, or in the community. And as we go into the Padlet, I'll just read this chat from Lauren. Lauren Maples is the executive director for PEAS, which I've mentioned a few times. And she says, we're currently working on removing the barriers for funding in this coming year and planning on underwriting schools for more than 35%, who have more than 35% economically disadvantaged schools or students. So coming soon, help for getting outside partner organizations like PEAS into the school. That's awesome news, Lauren. Thanks for sharing. Okay, so a quick Padlet check about community involvement and funding. Bonnie,
So
what
I
do you?
see someone, yeah, I see someone added already. I think we mentioned it before about Girl Scouts, doing special projects. Eagle Scout projects are an amazing thing. Know that they have to be a relatively substantial thing. It's not just about a cleanup. But if you, for example, are looking at establishing like a rainwater system, that's a great thing for an Eagle Scout project, or building a shed or a shade structure.
Or a compost system.
I actually had one time, part of an Eagle Scout project was that we made alphabet stones. So each stepping stone had a letter of the alphabet, and we actually created those. And then the Eagle Scout, as part of his project, made those and then embedded them in the decomposed granite walkway. So we created this like alphabet walkway, which is great. So those are really great. We've already talked about, like, obviously, like Scouts BSA or even National Honor Society needs certain volunteer hours. Young Men's Service League, Young Women's Service League. So there's a lot of those where they need volunteer hours.
And I see in the funding column, thank you for adding that grant writing tips resource. That's awesome. So that's a great place to get started. And another kind of plug for Donors Choose. If y'all haven't used Donors Choose before, check that out. Really awesome resource that's, I think, very friendly for teachers to use and send out to their communities.
I also would add something in the funding aspect where, we talked about home improvement stores, and a lot of times just getting that relationship with the manager there can not only, great if they can, throw some funding your way, but even more importantly, a lot of times they have like bags of mulch or soil that get torn and they can set them aside for you. So you don't necessarily care if it has a rip in it, but they're not going to sell it to a consumer. So they might give it to you at like 25% of the cost of the regular bag.
Yeah, exactly. And then I also see this on community involvement, reaching out to Parks and Rec because they might have some community gardens or educational resources. The city library is interested in doing nature programming. Awesome resource to share. As well, it's not a city department, but there's an organization called Keep Austin Beautiful, and they have in the past donated things like soil or mulch to school gardens. And they also have a tool sharing program. I have to say, I'm speaking pre-COVID knowledge. I have no idea what these programs look like currently, but this too shall pass, right? We're not going to be in this forever. So Keep Austin Beautiful can be a great resource to look into for tools and for soil and mulch donations. So I think for the sake of time, we're going to go back into the slides, Bonnie, and just kind of wrap up. But I want to reiterate that you guys are going to have access to this Padlet moving forward. We're going to send out the link to you when we send out the slides and the CPE certificates. So you'll be able to keep using this as a resource. And I really encourage you to visit that and keep adding ideas and, use it as kind of a sounding board. If you're having a challenge, put that on the Padlet and see if anyone responds. In the same vein, we do have a Facebook group that's open for any of y'all to join, and that information is going to be at the end of the presentation as well. And we're getting close. So what can we provide? Bonnie and I, as representatives of the School Garden Support Group, we just wanted to share one more time our resources. Bonnie runs the Sprouting Teachers Program, which is helping to establish relationships between coaches like Bonnie and Valerie and Katie, and do some mentoring to help teachers be comfortable and confident using the garden as a teaching resource and teaching out into the garden. And I run the UT Outdoor Intern Program. And so this is where you as teachers actually act as mentors to UT nutrition students. And even if you don't know anything about teaching outside, you know a lot about teaching. And our interns know a lot about nutrition, and they learn about horticulture through my class that they take. So it's really joining two complementary skill sets to accomplish one goal, which is to get students into the garden to learn more about where their food comes from and how to make healthy eating choices. So that's more of a mentorship relationship, but it really does go both ways. So don't feel like you have to be an expert in gardening to host a UT intern. And then we can also help, our program can also help to provide resources, both through Sprouting Teachers and the intern program. So we can help to connect you with available curriculum that's online, or help to, through Sprouting Teachers especially, help to modify your existing curriculum and put it in the garden. We can help connect you with grants or how to connect with certain community partners. You can attend trainings or webinars just like this one with us. We are happy to write letters of support once we have a relationship with y'all. If you are applying for a grant, or if you want someone to kind of back up the importance of your garden, we're happy to provide those letters. Or just to give you a third-party perspective, like, how am I doing with the garden? Can you guys just like tell me what I might need in order to make this a more strong program? We're happy to connect with you guys about any of those issues. Just to kind of give you another set of resources. On the next slide, we have the Central Texas School Garden Network, really great place to go and look at different resources and curriculum. The link for Spread the Harvest, which is that seedling and seed donation program through the Sustainable Food Center, is linked there. So it's a great program to look into. And then the associations for the Master Gardener programs through Travis and Williamson counties are listed here. If you live in a different county, it's possible that you have Master Gardeners. I'm not sure that they exist in every county, but they exist in many. And so you can definitely Google your county Master Gardeners, and you should be able to find your resources there. So our challenge and our ask to you, as the main takeaway from this webinar, is in the next week, y'all, I'm talking before Thanksgiving, okay? While this is fresh in your mind, before everyone goes on break and just like shuts their brain off for a week, meet with the stakeholders of your school garden. So if you have a committee, call a meeting. If you have other teachers that just love to use this resource, have a phone call with them and talk about these things. Number one, identify what's working well in your school garden. I know this is an anomaly of a year, but start here, right? What's working well right now? Don't wait until we go back to regular in-person classes to have these conversations, okay? The second thing you're going to talk about is, based on what you learned today, what are the top 3 action steps that you would actually realistically implement to improve your school garden? So, it's great to dream big, but bring it down for this conversation, right? So 3 action steps. Immediately, what can you do to improve your school garden? This could be as simple as starting to post on social media once a month about the garden. Really easy. This year, what do you want to accomplish to improve your school garden? And in the longer term, what do you want to accomplish to improve your school garden? Okay, so just talk about what you're doing well and set a few goals that are attainable, right? So when we think about goal setting, remember your SMART goals. So these are something that are going to be timely. So they have this, time frame that we've already established for you, measurable, so you can actually see if they're working. They're going to be realistic. So kind of think about actual goals that you can accomplish in the next week, you guys. That's the important part while it's still fresh. All right, if there's any other questions really quickly before we log off, we can go ahead and answer those. And while we're waiting for any of those to pop in, we'll just go to the last slide. And this is how you can keep in touch with us. Bonnie and my email are listed here. I already mentioned the Facebook group. You can check out the Texas Sprouts Project if you're not familiar with it. There's a great website. And all of this is kind of in relationship with, and will eventually, we think, be housed under the UT Nutrition Institute. So that website is there. And then the Padlet link is here as well. So look for a follow-up email from me by the end of the evening after the baby goes to bed, and you guys will get the slide deck from our presentation. There will be a link to the recording. If you attended the live webinar, you'll get your CPE certificate. You'll have a link to register for Dr. Davis's talk about Texas Sprouts and more about this report that we were kind of touching on today. And then you'll also have the Padlet link here. So look out for that email so you guys can have all of the resources at your fingertips. And thank you all so much for coming. Awesome turnout today.
Thank you guys so much.
Best of luck with your year and your gardens.
And if anyone has questions, you're welcome to just stick in the room and we'll be happy to answer any questions.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Be in touch.
Thank you.